Computer. Everything is recording. Friends, welcome. My name is Jake Goodman. I run the marketing for WeldWerks Brewing up in sunny Greeley, Colorado, and you are here. We're super stoked to have everybody here as part of the second session of Dialed In with WeldWerks, which is a series of virtual hangouts that we put together for a few reasons. One, why not? Two, we have some really brilliant voices on the team that know their stuff and are super engaging folks to listen to and to learn from, and also just as a means of hangout and distraction while we're kind of cooped up to a certain degree. So thank you so much for being a part of this. We do have more of them coming. Just FYI, next week on the 23rd, we have a big industry roundtable. It'll be Colin and Neil from WeldWerks. We got Jamie Bogner from Craft Beer and Brewing. We got Jeff Stuffings from Jester King. We got the Risers from Burial, Isaac Bernstein Miller from Reverie Distribution, Julia Hertz from the Brewers Association. And we're just going to get together and just kind of talk about how things are, how everything's looking, both from a consumer perspective and from a industry perspective. So that's going to be a bigger thing that we're doing next week. We just posted about it. It's at 6 o'clock Mountain next Thursday. So without any real further ado, I'd like to jump into things here real quick, just by way of introduction. The guy who's chatting today is Mr. Patrick PC Combs, one of the coolest motherfuckers that I know, and one of the smartest as well. Don't worry, you can swear here. It's fine. Not a biggie. And he has had a really awesome course through the industry. His most recent stints was as a sensory scientist at Avery, departed there to be the production manager at Cerebral, obviously one of our favorite places in all the world. And now he is our QA QC manager. Patrick is also an advanced Cicerone. If you're familiar with the program, there's 4 levels. You got your beer server, got your certified. Number 3 is advanced. And that's where they throw all the curveballs at you. It's kind of designed to make you fail to a certain degree. And he sat for the master Cicerone just recently and was just right there from passing that fucker. So he's going to be sitting for that again in October. And with any bit of luck, we will have one of approximately 20 master Cicerones in the world on our staff, and we're just so lucky to have him. And he is such a smart, erudite son of a gun. So without further ado, I pass it over to Patrick. The only thing that I have to do before we go, if you guys don't mind, if you want to toss into the chat just what you're drinking right now. I guarantee some of you got that heady slow pour that hit the Denver area. At least I'm hoping some of you do. Where are we all at? Perfect. I used to run the sales at WeldWerks, and before all those meetings, I would always have everyone do a shot. So I'm drinking a little bit of Old Granddad currently, and that's going to go right down the gullet. And then PC, without further ado, sir, please rock and roll with your bad self.
Cheers. Yeah, did you guys know that you can actually take beer? First lesson of the day, you can take beer and you can concentrate it down and you can put it in oak barrels and it gets you drunk faster. Did you know that? It's pretty cool. Big fan of that. So, got to wash that down with a little slow pour pills. We're here to talk about tasting, smelling and tasting beer. And that seems like an incredibly remedial thing to discuss. But I can assure you that I am still learning things every day about what I'm smelling and tasting, and how to better appreciate what I'm smelling and tasting. There's plenty of these Zoom meetings out there for beer style discussions. The Cicerone has one right now. They're doing a different beer style every couple days, and it's really great. Today we're going to talk about smelling and tasting, and the reason we had you choose those beers, German Pilsner and a Saison, is because they're going to be really great to kind of illustrate some of the points that we're going to discuss today. So if you've got those poured in front of you, definitely do that. If you don't have those poured in front of you, you may want to grab them right quick and just have them at the ready, because we will be talking through a little bit about what we smell and taste and what we see in these various beers. Why do we give a shit, right? Why do we give a shit about being the best smellers and tasters, right, of this product that Jake and I and other people probably on this chat work really hard to produce? And the reason is it's expensive. Beer is not a cheap product. It's certainly cheaper than some other options out there, but you know, we're in a day and age now where people are paying a premium price for beers that took a lot of time and consideration and care to create. And so we, as a staff, as a brewery, really hope that everybody that buys our beers is able to appreciate everything that we went into it. Because ultimately, every single can, every single collab, every single beer that you buy is an expression of a brewer and a brewery staff that put a lot of work into that product. And so the more that we can appreciate that, the more we sort of pay homage to people that make it, and quite frankly, just enjoy it. You know, the ability to illustrate and to articulate what you really like about a beer or what you really don't like about a beer is really important in figuring out exactly what it is that you're looking for when you go to the liquor store or when you hit up a release. Maybe there's a hop variety you don't like. Maybe there's an ester profile from yeast that you don't like. And we'll talk about all that. Real quick though, just to sort of give you a general overview of what you personally are capable of. The human sensory system is incredibly complex and is part of one of the things that makes us human. That's because we can detect up to, emerging research suggests, up to 1 trillion different odor compounds and combinations of those odor compounds. The previous to that, you know, we thought that it was probably around 10,000 and it was just different things presenting similarly as other compounds. But we think there's 1 trillion different aromas that you can differentiate between. And not only that, there are compounds that we can detect in 1 part per trillion. And 1 part per trillion, not as low as 1 part per trillion, we can detect it in parts per trillion. So it's multiple parts per trillion, but to illustrate the idea, 1 part per trillion is the equivalent, roughly, of putting 1 cup of water in the San Francisco Bay. So to say that you can detect a part per trillion or something in part per trillion is pretty insane, right? So we have this incredible sensory system, and if we can just harness it, we can get a lot more out of our beer. There's a ton of people that will say, you know, I've got a terrible palate. I'm awful at that off flavor, or I really hate, you know, this particular style, or that's just boring. It doesn't taste like anything. Well, the reality is you can smell and taste a lot more than you realize. You just have to dig through the layers and use the right techniques. Genetics definitely do play a role in that, though. There's a compound called diacetyl. I'm sure many people on this chat are familiar with diacetyl. Presents as butter or butterscotch, and was previously used in artificial butter flavoring in the microwave popcorn industry. So it really does smell like butter. It's commonly found in butter. It is one of the compounds in butter that occurs naturally. But diacetyl, for some people, they're completely blind to it, and other people are incredibly sensitive. And that's roughly, you know, divided in different segments of the population, but genetics do play a role there. There's another compound called indole, I-N-D-O-L-E, indole. Indole presents as jasmine flowers to some people, and to other people it presents as a fecal barnyard, right? So when somebody says, man, when I smell this, I just get, you know, like fresh flowers, I get jasmine, you know, it's just incredibly floral. And somebody else smells and goes, dude, that smells like barnyard, like that just smells like shit. You're both right. And that's sort of the brilliance of beer and sensory science and compounds is if you have an opinion about how something smells or tastes, it's not necessarily wrong, it's just how you're perceiving it. But we've got to give us the best chance at detecting these compounds, right? And to give us the best chance of detecting these compounds, we have to learn how to smell. And you would think that this is fairly straightforward, but my time as a sensory scientist, I learned very quickly that you'll take a beer to someone and you'll say, hey, can you smell this? Can you taste this? And the first thing they do is they bury their nose in the glass and they go, and they give it a big sniff. Well, the problem is that you completely overwhelm your senses, and most of what you just inhaled was CO2, because beer is a carbonated liquid, right? So all the CO2 is going to kind of compound in the glass, especially as these bubbles continue to pop. And so if I just take a huge whiff, it's not really going to tell me anything more. And you'll see differences, and we'll get to one of these questions. Somebody asked, what's the difference between smelling and tasting beer and smelling and tasting wine? And they use totally different toolkits. I just did the intro SOM class, and that was a huge learning curve for me because they have a totally different toolkit that they use to smell and taste things. So when we smell and taste beer, we never want to do a huge sniff. We're just going to dry out our nasal passages. We're not going to get anything extra out of the beer. We're not going to learn any secrets. So really the only way to smell beer is to use a few different techniques depending on what we're looking for. But a short sniff is really all it takes. And a short sniff is that long. And it's a teeny tiny amount of air. We're not taking a whole lot in. Our brain is incredibly powerful and is going to tell us way more than we realize about that beer and what we're smelling. And so when we do a short sniff, it's really just that. And then a long sniff, if we're looking for certain other things, might be that long, about 3 times as long, right? It's not a snort, right? We're not snorting our beer. A short sniff is all it takes. And then we just have to be mindful about what we're smelling. And what a lot of people don't realize is when you take a sip of beer, you take a sip, pay attention. What did your nose just do, right? We inhale every time that we take a sip, right? Every time you eat, you inhale at least a little bit of air. And that's really the only way that we're understanding what we're tasting. If you plug your nose and you take a sip of the same beer, it's going to be totally different because you're not going to get any of those aroma compounds. People think that when they taste beer, they're tasting beer in their mouth, but really what you're tasting is salty, sour, sweet, bitter, umami. And then what you're smelling is the beer. And so smelling is incredibly important to that. Short sniff, long sniff. Some people, when detecting things that are a little bit lighter, they'll do a flyover, right? Or a drive-by. I don't say drive-by because it's violent. So if you pass the glass under your nose and you're just gently looking for certain aromas, I don't like that. There are plenty of people that will tell you that drive-by or flyover is the only way to detect certain compounds. The thing that I do is I will actually use one of my nostrils, and everybody has a dominant nostril and it switches multiple times throughout the year. I don't know if you knew that, but your nostrils switch dominance throughout the year. It's really weird. Everybody does it based on allergy season, based on all these things. You have one nostril that you're pulling more air in through the other than the other. So when we hang a nostril on the glass, right, I usually always hang my right one. And you gently inhale. This roughly is an 80-20 ratio, right? Most of the air that we inhale, if I take a big breath in, most of the air that I inhale will come through my mouth, about 80%. Roughly 20% is through the nose. Totally depends on your own anatomy, but it's roughly an 80-20 ratio. And so if I hang one of my nostrils on this glass and I just gently inhale, you'll notice that you get the equivalent of a short sniff. And I find that that technique actually helps quite a bit in detecting things when I'm trying to see if a flaw is there or something of that nature. That may not be applicable for everyone, but that's sort of the smelling toolkit that I've used for my career and that I've trained a lot of people on. You'll find plenty of people that tell you, hey, this is the way. That's fine, and there are certainly some strong opinions in the industry, but I am a huge advocate that everybody has to learn the best techniques for them. So when you're smelling and tasting beer, you have to figure out what works best for you. Don't let anybody tell you that you're necessarily doing it wrong. If you're snorting your beer, you're probably not helping yourself. But that's important because then we have to parse out everything that we're smelling, right? And so there's quite a bit of stuff that we're going to smell. I've already had a little bit, but I've got my slow pour pills from Bierstadt, and I also have some Tank 7 from Boulevard. And we're going to smell these beers today. We're going to smell them, we're going to taste them, and we're going to sort of talk through the different levels.
Hey, Patrick.
People were asking, sorry, go ahead.
Before you jump in, real quick question. We got a question from John that I think is relevant here. So are you using your Diamond International to detect lighter, more subtle aromas to kind of not dilute it as much? Is there kind of like a threshold that you're trying to hit with one nostril versus the other? Is there benefits using both?
Sure, yeah. I find that I use that technique, the nostril hanging technique, when I'm looking for something that I don't know if it's there or not. So for instance, a situation in which you might use that is maybe there was a lager that was fermented improperly, right? And it had a flaw in it, and it was really light, but it was still relatively prevalent. You might need a little assistance in smelling that. So really what you're using that technique for is trying to find things that aren't super punchy, super in your face, right? You're using that technique to try to figure out, you know, is what I think, is it there or not? I think it's there, I'm not quite sure. That's sort of the goal of that technique. But again, you know, everybody's got to figure out what works best for them. There's another technique where you put your whole hand on top of the glass like this and you swirl it around and then you taste it. We're not going to talk about that because nobody needs to be putting their hands on their glassware in a pandemic. So we'll just skip over that one for now. Okay, so we have our smelling toolkit: short sniff, long sniff, fly over, hang it on the edge of the glass, smell it, taste it. We're doing a very simple ale versus lager comparison today, right? So our ale is our Saison. Ale is top fermenting, typically has esters, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Sometimes it might have phenols, which are another compound we're going to talk about in a minute. We're going to broadly categorize all of those. And then, of course, it has hops and malt, and there's some contributions even from water. But, so I have both my Tank 7 and my Slow Pour Pils poured in these two glasses, right? And you can't see it, but there's not a whole lot of difference, right? This is kind of a straw, pale yellow, and then this is, you know, more of a pale gold color, but the beers look relatively identical. Even down to the head on top is just kind of creamy and white, and it doesn't give me a lot of clue about what I'm about to drink. There's a lot of beer that looks exactly identical. How many New England IPAs look exactly identical, except they taste radically different? And if you have an ale and a lager in front of you, if you've bought a German Pils and you bought a Saison and you've got them both open in front of you, you'll notice how radically different they are. And they both use a different yeast. So one is top fermenting, ferments on the top, creates a lot of phenols and esters, ferments warm, that's ale. And then lager is always going to ferment relatively cool. And it's going to make some esters, but they're going to be in such low concentrations that most of the time, if the brewer has done their job, you're not going to smell any esters in a well-made lager. But you are going to smell a little bit of fruitiness from the hops. And so we're able to smell and taste these side by side and sort of figure out, okay, what's coming from hops, what's coming from malt, and what's coming from yeast. And our Saison is going to be that example that tells us what yeast is capable of doing, and our lager is going to tell us what malt and hops are capable of doing as far as lending sensory elements to the party. So our German lager is going to be relatively clean. When you smell that, you're going to get just a tiny bit of crackery, sort of bread doughy malt character. You'll get a tiny bit of, maybe not a tiny bit, a little bit more than a tiny bit, German noble hops. And when we talk about noble hops, it's just a categorization of some of the classic hop varietals from Europe. And those hops are, going to bring some floral, spicy elements, but you're going to very quickly be able to sort of pinpoint them as hoppy. And the malt is going to come off as that, crackery bread dough. Well, if you take the same thing and you take the Saison and you smell the Saison, it's a radically different experience. You have this huge bouquet of this fruity esters. You've got bubblegum, you've got banana, you've got, depending on which Saison you have a little bit of phenolic spiciness. So let's talk about each sort of element and what it brings to the party. Esters are always going to bring fruit, right? Esters are always fruit forward. We have an ester called ethyl acetate. And most people think that comes off as bubblegum or juicy fruit or, fruity, just general fruit. There's not a specific one. Whereas isoamyl is another ester, and that's going to come off as banana. But the broad categorization there is, if it's very ester forward, it's very perfumey, it's very fruit forward. Whereas phenols, that other compound that we were talking about that we sometimes see in Saison, is way more spice forward, right? So it might come off as clove, or it might come off as cinnamon, or it might come off as just baking spice. Or sometimes if you drink wild beer, if you drink stuff that's got a lot of Brett in it, Brettanomyces, it comes off as more of that Band-Aid medicinal kind of. And so we have this big range where we can go from like cinnamon clove to Band-Aid. And that all happens in that Saison category, right? It doesn't mean that we're always going to find those spicy notes in ale, just some of them. But lager should always be clean. We shouldn't really have any yeast notes in our lager. So this German Pils doesn't really have any yeast notes going on. And that's because it's from Bierstadt and it's very well made. And, you know, the hop character is subtle but present. The malt character is just a little bit doughy. It's nice and crisp. It's a little bit floral, but it's not fruity. It's not a fruit forward. It's not a spicy smelling. You don't get any of those notes. And so between the two, that's almost entirely yeast contribution. So the lager is much cleaner because of the fact that it's a different strain. Beyond that, you have to figure out, when you smell and taste those things, what is it specifically that you like or don't like? Because there's plenty of people. So I used to say, I'm just not a big fan of German beer. And that's because I didn't have an appreciation for what it was. And what I come to learn was German beer in general is almost entirely about lagers, and they have an ale tradition as well with Hefeweizen and Kolsch and that sort of thing. But what I came to learn was that the German lager brewing tradition was something that you had to understand in order to appreciate. And so if you can understand that, it's incredibly difficult to make a beer that has no yeast character and that is all about malt and hops and the water profile. That's all it's about, is those raw ingredients. The yeast is just a means to ferment the sugar water and get to an area that makes this incredibly refreshing beverage. Whereas on the Belgian side of things, they took a totally different approach. They used a whole bunch of different yeast strains, and they fermented them incredibly hot. So they would get tons of esters, they'd get tons of phenols, and they'd be these big complex aroma bombs. And so when you smell and taste through things that you like and don't like, you have to figure out, what is it that you're smelling and tasting, and why do you like it or not like it? And if you can come to that conclusion, then very quickly you understand what you like and what you don't like. And if you can articulate that, it's very easy to find what you sort of really enjoy and what you don't. So we'll use a similar technique in general with blind tasting. So if I had given you both of these beers, right, and I had said, what's the beer? And you had the German Pilsner in front of you, and you smell it, and you taste it, and you think about what it tastes like. There's no perfumey ester. There's no spicy phenolics. There's no, you know, there's not a whole lot of fruitiness, if any. And so when we taste that, we very quickly realize, okay, the yeast is not at work here. More than likely it's a lager, and more than likely it was, you know, well made, because we don't get any sort of flaws. But then if we taste the Saison, it's huge. You know, it leaps out of the glass with these fruity and spicy aromas. And so very quickly, I can put both of these into a category of, well, you know, this one is yeast driven and this one is not. And when we say yeast driven, we mean that the yeast is lending the most to the party. It's bringing fruitiness, it's bringing spiciness, it's bringing complexity. And if you understand that, you very quickly can sort of figure out what you enjoy most about beer, because we hate that feeling. I hate that feeling, even as an industry professional. If I spend, you know, if I spend $10 to $15 on a beer and I get home and I open it and I don't enjoy it, it's not very fulfilling. It's not very enjoyable. So that's definitely an important part. We were going to get into a couple of questions that sort of go into some of the finer points and some of the details here. So real quick, if anybody has additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But one of the ones that I definitely wanted to hit on was what are the differences between beer and wine tasting? And that one is relatively easy to jump into because beer and wine tasting is very different in the sense that wine is almost entirely aroma driven. You're certainly detecting acid level and you're detecting alcohol level when you taste it. But for the most part, most of wine tasting is aroma driven, whereas in beer, we really rely on the full experience. So we rely on retronasal to tell us a lot about the finish of the beer. So if you don't drink the beer and swallow, you can't get a full retronasal, right? What do we mean when we say retronasal? Well, retronasal is that air that's exhaled after I take a sip of beer. So I take a sip of beer and I exhale. And what do I detect on that retronasal that changes my opinion or reinforces my opinion about what I'm smelling and tasting? And so if you're able to pay attention to that exhale, you're able to get a lot more from beer. You'll notice that if you watch the Somm documentaries or if you've ever attended a professional wine tasting, the biggest thing that they do is they spit. You'll have those big spit cups, and they'll take a little bit of wine into their mouth and they'll swish it around and they'll aerate it through their teeth, and then they'll spit it out, and then they'll give you, it's this year and it's this vintage and it's this quality and it's this old. We can't really do that with beer, and that's because in order to get a full appreciation for it, we really have to have the entirety of the experience and the retronasal. Because when you swallow that beer, you have all that surface area in your throat, and then when you exhale out of your lungs, you're taking all of those aroma molecules and you're passing them back through that same sensory organ that tells you what you're smelling and tasting. With wine, you get a lot of alcohol vapors that kind of interfere with that, which is part of the reason that they smell and taste the way that they do. But we had a few other questions, right, Jake?
Sure. I think one of the ones that I think folks always look to is those differences between Pilsner lager, right? So is Pilsner style of lager, is it a close cousin to lager, but in a family of its own? This is coming from Mr. Corey Payne. What are the differentiators there, and kind of what are the lines of demarcation between these styles broadly and then more specifically as well?
Yeah, so Pilsner is not a German invention, it's a Czech invention, right? So Pilsner came from Pilsen. And this idea that, it's most closely, for the most part, associated with Germany. A lot of people assume that Pilsner is a German invention. It's not, it's a Czech invention. Pilsner is just a particular type of beer in the lager family using lager yeast. It's a little bit hoppier than something like a Helles. It's not quite as high in alcohol or intense as something like a Maibach, but those three beers are almost identical. You know, they're very similar in nature and approach. They all have their own subtleties and they all have their own differences. So when we talk about Pilsner, when we talk about lager, and that's sort of the confusing part in the marketing, right? Is you have some things that are labeled as American lager. Well, American isn't a style of beer, and lager is just a family of beer, so it gets kind of confusing. But Pilsner's just a type of lager beer. A lager beer is just one that uses lager yeast. An ale is just one that uses ale yeast. A lot of people, you'll have plenty of bartenders that tell you stories where somebody comes in and says, "Can I don't like ales very much. Can I get a stout?" And it's like, okay, well, stout is just an ale. It's a type of ale. But that's something that, that all came back to marketing back in the 50s when people said you had ale and lager beer and you had, various things that were sort of mislabeled. So there's a little bit of misunderstanding there, but, it all comes down to marketing for the most part.
What I haven't been on the other side of the bar for for a good decade or so, there was always that person who came in like, listen, I can't stand lagers, or I just can't stand ales. It's like, oh, friend, like, let's just chat just for a minute. Like, there's so much more there. There's so much more there.
Yeah.
Hey, so another great question that kind of came up is in reference to freshness and or age or lack thereof when it comes to both the Pilsners and Saisons. Now, I'm sure that most of us are aware that hoppy beers, of course, are going to fall off pretty significantly in a relatively short amount of time. But what kind of considerations do we have to bring to the table when we're talking about these types of styles, even just the ones we're talking about today? Just say the Pilsner and the Saison.
The old German adage is always drink within sight of the smokestack of the brewery, and that's because lager is really best consumed fresh, and my understanding is, and understandably so, that's why Bierstadt had such an opposition to canning, is because they really want people to enjoy their lager that they put so much time into. They want them to enjoy that poured in the glass that they want it poured in, and straight out of the tap, as fresh as can be. And that's because packaging does introduce a tiny bit of oxygen. We do have equipment these days that introduces a few parts per billion oxygen. Most of the stuff that we can at WeldWerks is under 40 parts per billion oxygen. But that doesn't mean that it won't taste perfect. Packaging is always going to be a little bit different than draft, right? But when it comes down to freshness, that definitely affects what we're looking for in a packaged on date, right? Saison is relatively robust, and that's because there's not a whole lot of residual sugar. They don't typically use a lot of specialty malts, and it's usually a little higher in alcohol. Usually you find Saison in the neighborhood of 7 to 9%. You can find table Saison as well. That's not quite as high in alcohol. But the difference in age and how that sort of presents in the beer is going to come down to how it was packaged, how strong in alcohol it is, and if there was any additional adjuncts. Hopefully, if you're buying a Pilsner, you're not buying something with a lot of adjuncts in it. And that's because, at that point, why are you buying a Pilsner, right? But it should be relatively fresh. If it's from a high quality producer, most of the time they're going to have very low DO, dissolved oxygen in the beer. And it's going to keep for 60 to 90 days in a can. And if it's much beyond that, it's a little bit dicey, but if they have really high-end techniques, then it may still be good after 90 days. People's shelf lives vary pretty dramatically. Saison is totally different, and that's really because it's got higher alcohol, and higher alcohol beers are always going to age more gracefully than low alcohol beers. And that's just because alcohol has a antioxidant effect on beer. And so a 9% Saison is going to taste great most of the time after 6 months or longer. A 6-month-old German Pilsner is going to taste pretty awful. It's going to taste like a ghost of a former Pilsner. It's not going to have, the delicate floral hop quality. It's not going to have the same fresh bread dough malt quality. It's going to be kind of a shell of its former self.
Totally. Do you want to touch specifically more on Saison in any way, specifically as a style, or should we just kind of keep the question train rolling? I'm putty in your hands as we are.
It's sort of up to everyone. I mean, we can sort of work through more of the questions. We had a lot of questions asked, so we can get to a few more of those, and then if we have time at the end, we can jump into more history. But, my goal in this talk is to just try to equip people with real-world tools that they can use to better enjoy their beer. So,
well, to that end, there's actually a great question that just popped up in the chat. Dan asking why folks are saying that beer tastes better in cans than it does on draft. There's lots of talk with IPAs and stouts.
Oh yeah.
But still, so how are you differentiating the tasting experience, or maybe even beyond that? Can you bust some of the myths surrounding because I'm sure everyone remembers, like, now everybody drinks. I mean, I have 3 cans in front of me right now, right? That was not a thing until Oscar Blues, really kind of paved that trail, and now we're all on the can train. So is there anything that we can speak to as far as how different packaging methods come to bear on the sensory experience one way or another?
Yeah, so we're always going to have package shock. Anytime we move beer from one vessel to another, we're always going to have package shock, right? And package shock usually takes a day or two, sometimes a little bit longer to take full effect. And it changes the beer slightly, but it doesn't change the beer radically. And that's because we've introduced a little bit of oxygen, we've transferred the beer to a new environment. Most of the time, unless the beer is pasteurized, and there are plenty of beers that are pasteurized that are high risk for re-fermentation, meaning they start fermenting in the can again. But plenty of beer is raw, meaning that it's still a living thing. There's still yeast that's alive. There's still lots of things going on in that can. When we talk about differences in package type, right? Draft compared to can. Most of the time when you say, oh, it was better on draft, it was because that it was either served more appropriately at a proper temperature in a proper glass, or some of the other factors that go into that are how much oxygen was introduced into the can when it was canned, right? So if you have really high oxygen in those cans, it's going to taste radically different than it does on draft. But when it comes down to something like New England IPAs, which obviously we make a lot of at WeldWerks, the thing is, most of the time, those beers have so much hops in them. They have so many of these compounds that are super intense. There are plenty of compounds that need to oxidize. They need a little bit of oxygen, and they need a little bit of time, and they need a little bit of aging. And that's because they round off towards a week or two. And there's plenty of producers that I can think of that, when you buy their beer the day after it's canned, it's like chewing through hop pellets. It's really intense. But you drink that same beer 2 weeks later, and it's just a juice bomb. I mean, it's like opening, a can of Dole tropical pineapple juice blend and drinking it straight. Like it's so insanely aromatic. And a lot of that comes down to those compounds just sort of, some of them oxidizing, some of them rounding off, some of them denaturing and slightly in some way, and then you're left with essentially a fruit bomb. So when people say, better than draft or better in can, it really just comes down to the natural oxidation curve of the beer and where it lands.
Great question from Brendan Van Jacobs. It gets, for me, to some brass tacks as well. And the question is, what strategies do you use to identify scents and flavors, and how do I get better at identifying them? And this one resonates with me in particular, having a bit of a background in wine, just from the fine dining days. One of the smarter and just sharper somms that I ever got training under, he asked us, all right, so we've got this particular wine, and you're curious at this beginning stage that you're at, how it is that I'm picking up notes of this fruit and that thing, and all of these different compounds and hints of certain flavors that I understand that you guys don't actually pick up. And so he asked us, as this whole group, he's like, when was the last time that you went into the supermarket and picked up, a mango and just smelled the skin? When was the last time you picked up a blackberry and broke it open and smelled what that was like? When was the last time, instead of, I have a 4-year-old at home, so I make, a million butter jelly sandwiches a week. When was the last time that I actually smelled what jammy is like as a flavor compound, or as a style of flavor, as opposed to just thinking that I know what that means? And so that one hits home for me in particular, just because I don't think we arm ourselves enough with the direct sensory experience with what those things actually smell like, right?
Totally.
What does pith smell like? What does the skin smell like? What does the flesh smell like? What are all of these things that kind of come together? So do you have any of those sorts of tips and tricks that people can use to actually differentiate what those sometimes really minute flavors are in the context of any particular beverage they might be drinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just being as mindful as possible when you're smelling and tasting things, right? If you're having a salad at a restaurant and it's got, a crazy dressing, pick apart the dressing and figure out what are the flavor elements of that dressing. If you watch Food Network, there's plenty of competitions and challenges where they'll give them a dish and they have, 30 seconds or a minute to taste every component of the dish and try to reverse engineer that dish. If you're just mindful of what you're smelling and tasting, you'll start to think about, what does this remind me of? What does this smell like? What does it taste like? Does this remind me of something in my past, right? So smelling is a very emotional thing. When people say scent is the strongest sense tied to memory, 100% true. When you smell isoamyl acetate, or when you smell one good one for me is malic acid. When I smell malic acid, I think of sour candy. And you can only smell malic acid in really high concentrations. Well, when you smell malic acid, you think of sour candy because that's the compound that they make sour candy with. And when you start to become mindful of what you're tasting, you can start to parse out more specific, more crazy things. One of the most interesting exercises I did from a sensory side was I had all of my panelists at Avery eat corn chips. So I bought 10 different brands of corn chips. And everybody walked into the training room and they were like, this is the weirdest thing. And it was just 10 individual corn chips laid out on Petri dishes in front of them. And their only instruction was eat the chip and smell it, taste it, and then write down the 3 descriptors. And at first people were really hesitant, and they were kind of shocked that we were just eating chips for sensory training today. But by the end, people were arguing about which corn chip was better and why. And they were able to parse out like, I really didn't like this organic brand because the oil tasted burnt. Well, what about the oil tasted burnt? Oh, well, it has this like, really smoky, greasy thing where, it kind of tastes a little bit like bacon, but like, rancid. All right, cool. You're really good at tasting corn chips. So all we have to do is apply the same method to beer, and blind tasting, through a 6-pack is a really great way to do that. Go to the Pick 6 section at your favorite liquor store and get a Pick 6 of 6 styles that are all relatively similar. Get 6 different lagers because it's going to cost you $10. And if bars were open right now, you would be paying $8 for a pint of IPA, right? Or $7 for a pint of IPA. So go get a Pick 6 of lager and come home, and if you've got another person there, have that person open all 6 of them and pour them. And then you could pour those 6 for that person too, and just set up a blind tasting and smell and taste through each one and talk about each little item that you like or don't like. And it's going to be, for 2 people, it's going to cost you $5, and you're both going to drink 3 beers total. So it's going to be a great time, and you're going to learn a whole lot.
And I'd like to add to that, and please feel free to comment on this if you like. But I think some people get the sense sometimes that they're just not good at this sort of thing, or they don't have the genetic gift. Now, granted, there is such a thing as super tasters, right? There are people who just have the capability, through whatever genes they got, that they sense things in a different way. However, at the end of the day, this isn't, it's really just repetition and practice and digging into the nitty gritty details. I mean, I have probably 3, journals this thick full from just sitting down and like taste, I had no clue what the fuck I was talking about, but I would just, this is what this sounds like to me. This is what this tastes like. This is what the carbonation is. And then slowly over time, like any other skill, that kind of refines. So I don't know if you have any advice for folks, because I just sometimes I get bummed when I hear people say I don't know, I guess I'm just not born to pick that up, or I'm just not, because I don't think that's the thing. I think we all kind of have it in us. It's just a skill that has to be acquired over time.
No, totally. And the only reason I got really, really good at blind tasting is because, not right now because of the pandemic, but probably within 30 days, I'll start drinking 40 beers a week blind. And so I just do a whole lot of blind tasting. I'll go and I'll buy 2 cases of blind mixed sixes from a couple of different liquor stores, and I'll smell and taste through those blind flights, and I'll call the style. And you start to become very familiar with what you like and what you don't like, and what styles are and what they aren't. And so this whole idea that like, and this is a myth that's been aggressively pushed in the wine industry, because unfortunately, and I'm not trying to say it's us versus them, because it's not. But the wine industry has a lot more pomp and circumstance behind it, where certain vintages and certain producers are acclaimed to be the best producers or whatever, and then you put some of these supposed super tasters in wine through blind tastings, and they can't necessarily pick it out every time. Whereas if you did a blind tasting of lambic, there would be plenty of people, even just in the local Denver community, that could call the producer of lambic from every beer that you put in front of them. And so beer is and has always been this sort of common man's beverage, right? Beer was for the poor people in Rome, and wine was the drink of the aristocrats, right? But beer was the drink of the commoner and the slave. And it's because it was cheap and easy to produce, and I'm sure they had their own fun little beer circles back then. But the thing is, all of this information and everything that I know has been acquired for the most part from smelling and tasting, buying pick sixes, and just self-study online.
Totally. Sorry, I said totally, but I was muted. It was one of those wordless totallys, as it were. I really like this question. I don't think this guy's even on the call on the session, but question is, how do you break down a beer that you don't like? And I really love that question for 2 reasons. One, I think it's important to always phrase things not just as this is good or bad versus this is what I personally appreciate or don't appreciate about it. And there's always something to appreciate about almost any beverage that you dig into. And so kind of figuring out what it is that you like or don't like kind of goes into that. But then at the same time, I think sometimes there's like especially, the beer community is insular, right? And so we all kind of get this kind of herd mentality sometimes with certain beers or certain styles or what have you. Like if you don't like this, you're stupid and you shouldn't be even drinking beer. And you kind of touched on this before, that your own tastes are your own. But how do you really, as objectively as you can, evaluate something that you don't like, and also kind of have the courage to say, like, yeah, I think this shit sucks. Like, I'm sorry, you guys love it. Like, maybe 95% of the beer drinking world loves this thing. I just don't, and I'm okay saying.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand that, and what it comes down to is figuring out exactly what the element is that you don't like about it. And a good friend of mine in college, and still a good friend of mine today, used to tell me that he loved Leffe Blonde, and Leffe Blonde has, for me, it has a bacon note to it, and I hate that beer because of the bacon note. And it literally just comes off as it's a phenolic compound, and it comes off as smoked meat or just bacony. And I can remember smelling and tasting that beer and thinking, like, this is disgusting. It smells like bacon. It tastes like bacon. that you put in my beer. This is not what I want to drink. And what it came down to was genetics. He was not sensitive to that compound. He did not think it smelled and tasted like bacon. I thought it smelled and tasted like bacon. That was very simple and very easy for me to pick out because it was so strong. But there's usually at least a few beers, and I guarantee you everybody on this call today right now has at least one beer that they can think of that they hated in the last month, where they opened it or they were served it and it was gross. And for somebody else, it might have been incredible. You really just have to start unpacking it. You really have to just start naming, like, what comes to mind, what's right there. Why do you not like it? For me, on that Belgian beer, it was bacon, and it was right there at the top of the flavor profile. I brought the glass up to my nose, and it was like, bacon, gross. Well, what is it about the beer that you don't like? What is it? You know, get on with it. What are you smelling? What are you tasting that you don't like? And there's plenty of people that will say, they'll smell and taste the beer and they'll go, it was terrible. I don't know, it just wasn't as good as X. Okay, well that even that gives us a starting point. It wasn't as good as X. Well, what did X have that this beer doesn't? Oh, well, it had this crazy pineapple note, and it's super tropical, super intense, and I don't know, I really liked it. Okay, well, what's in your beer that's not in this other beer? And if they're the same producer, then you can very quickly say, okay, well, this beer, Tank 11, has Citra, Mosaic, and Eldorado, and Bierstadt doesn't list the hops on the outside, but I can tell you it's Hallertau middle fruit. Okay, well, I don't like this because, and I love slow pour fills, but you could say, well, I don't like how the herbaceousness, it's a little strange. It comes off as too spicy. Or maybe you taste Saison and you say, it's just a little too busy. Well, okay. Maybe you just don't like perfumey esters. Maybe you've never had one before. Because if you drink German Pils next to Saison, and I give somebody that's never had beer before, I give them a Pils and a Saison, and they smell and taste both of them, and they're saying, wait a second, they're both beer? Yeah, but, radically different beer. So it really is just about naming it and then searching, right? Trying to figure out exactly what it is that you're smelling and tasting. And you can do that a little bit through self-study, something like Tasting Beer. If you read Tasting Beer, it will provide some answers to a general foundational overview for sort of what is in your beer. Or you can just start asking questions. A lot of breweries are very interactive on their Facebook pages and everywhere else. And so if you get a particular, so something of lager that we didn't talk about today, sometimes lager has a tiny touch of sulfur, right? If lager has a tiny touch of sulfur and you get a lager at the tap room and it's incredible, and then you go home with a 4-pack of it and you open it at home and you get a tiny touch of sulfur when you're pouring it in your glass, right? So you're pouring your lager in your glass and you're like, oh man, this smells like rotten eggs. Well, that's a tiny touch of hydrogen sulfide. It's totally natural. And the reason you're smelling it out of the can into your glass and you didn't smell it at the tap room was because somebody else was pouring your beer. And so it really is just sort of getting down to what is the specific thing that you don't like. And if you don't know, then figure out what you do like and then try to figure out what that beer doesn't have.
Awesome. I want to get to one more PC. I don't know what your time constraints look like. If folks want to continue to stay on and you have a few extra minutes, we can dive into some like extra questions if you're into that.
Totally.
Okay, cool. But the one I do want to hit at this point, the OG homie Austin Grippin had a couple great questions that I just in case folks have to hop off right at 3. 2 of them that I just really enjoyed. One, what beer style do you enjoy the most and why from a sensory perspective, right? Like which style just like creates sensory fireworks for you? And then the follow-up, which I think is one of my favorite questions I've seen with these so far. Does Patrick enjoy drinking anything anymore? Which, is funny. We kind of, joke internally at the brewery sometimes that, yeah, I'm just I'm on the bourbon train. You know, I've had too much beer. It's kind of it's worn out its welcome with me. But you know, there is this certain sense of like I don't want this beverage to ever lose its luster, right? So how do you keep your interest and your passion and your love for this thing that you work so closely with? How do you keep that alive over time? And then of course also what just from a sensory perspective, which which style makes your toes curl?
Which style makes my toes curl is
I
hard.
had to phrase it that way. I don't know.
Because as someone that's trying to pass Master Cicerone, I love all beer styles because you have to. If you don't love all beer styles, then you'll fail because it's really hard. So you have to understand every beer style. And so I don't hate any beer style. There's certainly beer styles that I'll choose over others. So the other part of that question was, what are some beers or compounds that you don't like, or off flavors, or that sort of thing? I still enjoy beer every single time that I open it. I opened a slow pour pills at 11:30 when I was cleaning up and getting ready for this talk, and that first sit of the day is always the most incredible experience ever, because when you fully realize what goes into that sit, it's a life-changing experience every single time for me. I'm fully dedicated and fully passionate to understanding what exactly I'm smelling and tasting every single time that I do it. But that doesn't mean that you don't get totally burned out, and that doesn't mean that you don't get tired of some styles. And I go through all kinds of waves where it's like, this week I'm drinking Saisons. I'm gonna get hammered on Saisons and it's delicious and I love it. And then other weeks it's like, this week I really need to study Helles and how it compares to Kolsch and Pils and Maibach and Czech Pils, and you're doing sort of the, you know, sort of digging through the trenches kind of thing, right? Where you're just trying to pick out the subtlest nuance between things. My favorite beer to drink is one that's very interesting, one that has a lot of layers to dig through, and that changes every single week. So if you put a goose in front of me, a sour Belgian, you know, spontaneously fermented beer, I get incredibly excited because I get to pick through. One of the coolest things that happened to me was when the owner of Finn's Manor down in Denver did a goose pack that you could buy. You could buy 5 375s of 5 different gooses, and he would pour them for you, and you'd taste through all 5 of them. And I did that, and you know, we, in a group of 2 or 3 people, sort of dug through every single layer of that beer, and we could pick out, you know, wet stone covered in Meyer lemon and really weird taste descriptors. But you know, those beers are incredibly wild because they didn't do anything to them. Whatever nature decided to ferment that beer with, that's what happened. The stuff that makes my toes curl is a hard question, because any beer that is aggressively flawed, I have a really sad, like, ASBC commercial sad moment every single time that I like get a beer up to here and it's just awful. So your 30-second beer flaw education, green apple or Sharpie marker or solventy is usually acetaldehyde. Butterscotch or butter is usually diacetyl. Papery or wet cardboard or lipstick is usually trans 2. And those 3 compounds are usually found in not so good examples of the style or older examples of the style. And the thing is, when you have a flawed beer, I hope everybody in the session right now is drinking a beer that they really like. And I hope you're getting enjoyment out of it. But everybody on this call, everybody on this Zoom session, you've all had a beer that you didn't like, right? And you can think about maybe like, I didn't like it. Well, why didn't you like it? And you may not be able to articulate that, and that's okay. But if I said, okay, but what's a beer in the same style category that's better? And you would you would light up. Most people light up every single time, and they're like, oh man, well, this IPA, I didn't like this IPA at all, but the IPA that I like the most is Odell IPA, and I like Odell IPA because it's got this incredible grapefruit pomelo thing, and people start to, you know, articulate everything that they like about their favorite beer. And so this whole idea of like, you're really bad at smelling and tasting, it's just a myth. You know, it really is something that you just have to work past, and you have to have a little bit more confidence. But my favorite beer is I guess the most complex one in front of me.
I'm an Orval man through and through. That's
Yeah.
question, and that's one of those ones that'll change on you over time as well. If you store some away and toss it in the cellar over here.
I have a 30-second Orval story if people want to hear.
Oh, it's such good. Go for it. Rock it.
Orval is nuts because some people try to improve their process, and improving your process is important, right? Well, Orval decided to bring in consultants, and the consultants came in and said, holy shit, you guys don't use the right chemicals on your tanks. They're covered in Bierstone. And so they were like, their tanks were really dirty with like mineral deposits, right? So they bring in a consulting service. The consulting service says, you need to start acid washing everything. So they start acid washing everything. Well, as it turns out, the Brett that was native to Orval died because it was living in all of the Bierstone. So their poor process was the reason that Orval was a beer to begin with. And so then they had to bring in microbiologists, and they had to culture all the Brett from around the monastery and figure out which Brett strain it was. And then they had to start inoculating all the bottles with that Brett strain, because as soon as they brought in the consultants fixed everything. And then it was like, oh shit, the beer is nothing like it used to be. So
did any of that get to market, do you know?
This was years and years ago. This was like early 2000s when they were really like modernizing. So no, probably not, because I don't think it bottle conditioned, because I'm pretty sure they still bottle condition with that Brett strain. So.
Yeah. Hey, would you mind speaking just a little bit quickly? Nick actually posted it here in the group chat, and also did in the Zoom sign up as well, just about the journey, the Cicerone journey, kind of going from server, and he's saying just starting the certified beer server study, right? So kind of taking those different steps throughout, and maybe even because this is a question I've kind of wondered myself, you know, is it in my best interest, or is it worth going to whatever that next level is, whatever level I might be, even if it's at 0 going to 1 or 1 going to 2 or what have you. What is the value that you find in that program, and you know, how do you personally gauge, you know, you're headed for the highest, you know, the highest peak in the land, so to speak. You know, why was that journey right for you, and why would maybe stopping at certified be right for Joseph?
Yeah, I studied and took advanced because it was there and I wanted to see if I could do it. And the first time I took it, I got a 79.5, and you need an 80, and they don't round. So at that point, then it was like, well, I just took this to see if I could do it. I think I'm pretty close, so I think I have to do it again because I'm so close and I put so much time into it. And then it really became a labor of love in the entire preparation process. I hated German beer before I started studying for certified. And as soon as I studied for certified, and I you know, put in all the time with blind tastings and all in the history and the production methods and all that stuff, you just develop a really great appreciation for the product that you're drinking. And so I would encourage anybody that really loves beer to try to go through the certified level, because even if you're not going to use it for anything, it's a fun hobby, and it makes you a better consumer of beer, and it makes you essentially an ambassador of this thing that you love so much. And as a country, the United States has very much so gone astray as far as beer goes, right? Or previous to the craft beer revolution. We were at a situation in the 60s and 70s where you could buy beer on the shelf called beer. that was just in a white can that just said beer. And that's what beer became for a lot of people. And all of the people that came to the United States came from countries that had beer traditions. There's almost no country in the world that does not have some sort of fermented grain beverage tradition. And so our ancestors were drinking this product and exploring this product. And now we're really just discovering sort of what it is that we're smelling and tasting and drinking. And so if you have a passion about beer, if you have an interest, it's beneficial to even just read Tasting Beer by Randy Mosier is a great foundational knowledge. If it interests you beyond that, you should absolutely dive deep into it, because as soon as you do, it becomes like, for me, it became like this thing where it was a rabbit hole where you would say, okay, well, what is that bubblegum aroma? And research that. And then it's, okay, but it has this spicy bacon thing going on. What is that? Okay, I'm going to start homebrewing. Oh no, there's all these off flavors. What did I do wrong? And you start learning sort of what's going on in your beer. And even if you never get a job in the industry, you'll have such a deep appreciation for what it is that you're smelling and tasting. It will be such an enjoyable experience every time that you go to a brewery or tap room, as long as you're going to the right ones. If you're going to a brewery that is not making good beer or has some problems, then it may not be very entertaining or interesting, and it will sort of reaffirm like, whoa, all right, so that's not what I was looking for, and that's okay. When you go to one where you really like it, like every time I go to Bierstadt, it's an incredible experience because I know what that beer is supposed to be, and I know what I'm looking for when I taste that. My trajectory was exclusively self-taught for the most part. I didn't go to school for this, and that may come as somewhat of a shock to some people, but I'm not afraid to say it because I'm confident in the peer-reviewed articles that have been published by so much of our industry brethren in this crazy industry. I have a marketing degree. I do not have a science background. I do not have a biology background. I graduated from a business school, and I was obsessed for the last decade with what I was smelling and tasting, and that very quickly devolved into pursuing the Cicerone program, because that's one of the easiest ways to show that you at least know what you're talking about, right? Ray Daniels has developed a program that is incredibly stringent. I just took master. I had an awful written score. It was high 60s. I had the highest tasting score, and I had like a decent oral score. So it doesn't matter the fact that like my interviews were amazing, my tasting was like top notch, my essays high 60s. Doesn't cut it. So I couldn't write fast enough, and now I'll take it again, and hopefully I'll pass. But it's one of those things where all of this information is available out there for you right now. You can close out of this Zoom meeting and you can say, today I will become a beer expert, or I will start the journey to become a beer expert. All of the information is out there. You might have to pay like fees to MBAA, Master Brewers Association, to get to some of their articles to learn some of this technical knowledge. But we're in the Wild West right now, because this is just research in America, in the last 40 years. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunity. There's going to be a lot of really interesting careers and positions that become available because of this.
That's awesome, man. Thank you. I'll toss two more out there if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Cool. Got to give a shout out to Joe V, who has probably spent more money at WeldWerks than I think some people make in a year. He is asking about some hop varietals. So they change from crop to crop, right? So like we'll head out and we'll go do hop selection out in Yakima. We'll get this bomb Eldorado one year, and next year it's just kind of falls flat. Same thing with your Citras and really with all of them. We found a lot of surprises with Lotuses and some of those other ones. What is what precipitates that? And granted, I know that if this isn't something that is totally up your alley, please let us know. But from what you know of, as far as temperatures, precipitation, just the overall conditions of kind of each crop year, should we be expecting that, our say juicy bits, right? Citra Mosaic Eldorado, that it will drastically change from year to year based on these environmental factors, or is there some sort of reliability within the crop itself that it will kind of stay consistent in some form or fashion?
So this is the problem. The problem is we've radically changed the way that we bring new hop varieties and even new malt varieties to market. It used to be that it was a 10 to 20 year process depending on the factors there. And if it was a 10 to 20 year process, that means at the end of 10 to 20 years, you had an incredibly stable plant, or you had an incredibly stable producer of whatever it was that you were looking for. And it was largely driven on numbers of how much alpha acid they have, which is just bittering capacity. And flavor was a little bit important, but not largely. I think we probably lost, thousands, hundreds, if not thousands, of incredible hop varieties from German research in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that's because when Germany, especially today, they realize there's a demand for it. But back in the day, they would smell a hop and they would say, "Oh man, that's incredible. It's like fresh crushed oranges with lime skin." Nope, throw it away, because that's not what people wanted in their beer. And so Cascade for a long time was like, Cascade came out in 1973. It was a USDA hop, and it came out in 1973. And when it came out, everybody was like, tons of grapefruit, gross. And then Ken Grossman got his hands on it and said, "Wow, this is incredible. I think we can make beer with this." And we have Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and craft brewing. And really, you should attribute that to Fritz Maytag, who created IPA, if we're arguing. But he put in the work, Ken Grossman and Fritz Maytag put in the work to use Cascade hop as a new variety. And it took decades before we had another hop variety that was even similar to Cascade that was as applicable and usable as Cascade was. And so the reason that we see such a lag, or we see radical crop differences, is hop producers are trying to get their money hop to market as quickly as possible, because they want to profit off of that hop, and they want to give people experimental hops to mess around with. And what it comes down to with a lot of these hops that we're seeing, Sabro is one of my favorite new ones, and it's because it's so radically different. And I guarantee you, if we polled the entire room right now and said, who likes Sabro, who doesn't, it might even be a 50-50 split. But Sabro is one of those hops that comes along and kind of disrupts the market a little bit, because it's got such a crazy woody vanilla coconut thing along with tropical fruit that it changes your perception of what hops can be. And so unfortunately, we are going to see some variation. We're going to see some variation in what hop varieties smell and taste like. We're going to see some variation when they have an experimental variety and then they name it and they release it. So Sabro used to be an experimental variety. So you saw we have an experimental series at WeldWerks called New Hops Who Dis, and we have a new one coming out with Trident hops. Trident is a new hop variety, and whether or not Trident will smell like it does in 2 or 3 years, I couldn't tell you. And it's because the plants continue to change. Hops stay in the ground. So when you plant hops, they don't, it's not like cannabis. So cannabis is very similar to hops as far as genetics go. Cannabis, you plant a seed, you grow a plant, you get flowers, you kill the plant, you dry the flowers, and then you do whatever you want to with those flowers. Hops are different in that they're perennial. They come back every single year, right? So they're going to change. They're going to evolve. They're going to develop their own characteristics. They're going to some in the area will be better than others. And so that really is just the difference between the speed at which we try to bring new varieties to market.
And the one thing I can echo off of that is, I feel that experimental hops get a bad rap to a certain degree. Maybe you just see HBC number, and you're like, it's not Citra or Mosaic or Galaxy or Nelson or whatever. But I just encourage everyone to get the perspective that all of those hops were experimental at one point. There was never this time where, these things just fully existed and then all of a sudden we just kind of realized how great they were. No, this was a process over time. And so when especially hop forward breweries try and push out some of these experimental hops, it's because we think that they're worth your attention in one way or another. No, they're not. They're not Mosaic. They're not any of these, but that's the point, right? Like the point is, how far can we push this idea of flavor? How far can we push the idea of what a hop can do in anything, really? Now, granted, we're talking about WeldWerks here to a certain degree, so we're looking at extremely hop forward beers, and so kind of pushing that. But they have their place, and so I really want to encourage people to have as much of an open mind as possible, because we're not just going to grab a hop and put a beer into it because it's like, well, I don't know, it's experimental, it should be fun, right? Cool. No, it's because we've gotten it in our hands and we have determined that it can add value to a beer, except for Zappa. That's just a fucking lost cause. There's I'm gonna combo these two real quick and then we can call it a night. PC, I think you're the best person to ask this question to, and you could spiral into a half-hour conversation about this. But if you could give a quick elevator pitch about how you approach beer and food pairing,
okay,
what would that be? And then and then just tack on to the end of that from Chris, any recommended reading to build general beer knowledge? I know you mentioned Randy, of course. You've got Garrett and whatnot, but any sort of resources that you have to leave everybody with on that note of something they can take home and keep rolling with.
Yeah. So as far as books go, and beer and food pairing, Brewmaster's Table is an incredible resource, and Garrett Oliver is an incredible beer scholar that has been a integral part and a very important part of the beer community for a long time. I would say in Brewmaster's Table there are a few things history-wise that have been disproved that haven't been updated. So don't read Brewmaster's Table for a guide on beer history. But read it for the beer pairings. Brewmaster's Table will give you an idea and this incredible perspective from Garrett Oliver that will tell you the exact beer pairing for a lot of common dishes. He even has an appendix in the back where you can read through if I want to make mussels, what do I serve with mussels? What are some of the options? Well, you could do goose, but if you don't do goose, what could you do instead of goose? I've got wheat beer. Could I do wheat beer? Yeah, you could do wheat beer. And here's what it's going to do. And here's what hopefully you could add. Lemon. Lemon and wheat beer, great mussel pairing. But beyond that, as far as beer and food pairing goes, a sort of elevator pitch, you want to make sure that you match intensity, right? So we're not going to serve a Pilsner with a steak. A Pilsner with a steak is still going to be refreshing. The Pilsner is still going to scrub the steak off of your tongue, and you're still going to enjoy the steak more because of the Pilsner, but it's not going to be as good as if you served it with a Dunkel. And if you served it with a Dunkel, what's going to happen? Well, the Dunkel is brown, and the steak is also brown. Hopefully you've got a nice thick crust on that steak, and hopefully with the Dunkel, it's nice and toasty, And if you have a toasty dunkel with a steak, it's going to be a better pairing because instead of the Pilsner, you have a little bit of the same notes. You have a little bit of the same melanoidin reactions in that beer that you have with that steak, right? So it's going to be a little bit more enjoyable. And that's just so we talk about compare and contrast, right? So those two things are going to resonate with each other. And if instead you decided to serve that steak with an IPA that was nice and dry and earthy and, you know, dank, like a West Coast IPA or like Maharaja from Avery or Odell IPA or Tree Shaker or something like that, right? They're going to have a lot more notes that contrast with that, the crust on that steak, right? As far as other resources go, you can buy like Oxford Companion to Beer, but that's one that you really just use as a resource to look things up. Tasting beer is that foundational resource, and then when you work beyond that, you can go more towards stuff that you're interested in. So, for instance, if you were really interested in Goza, Fal Allen from Anderson Valley just wrote a book on Goza. And so if you're really interested in Goza and you want to look it up, you can read the whole book on Goza. You can read what's his name? Stan Hieronymus. Stan Hieronymus is a legend. Stan Hieronymus does not publish facts that are not backed up by at least 1 to 2 sources, which I love about Stan Hieronymus. Is it's either a first-hand interview where he sat down. If you read Brewing Like a Monk, you'll learn everything you've ever wanted to know about Trappist beer, and it's because he sat down with each Trappist monastery and he talked to them about what they did. And so if you want that, like, you know, end-all be-all knowledge, a lot of his books are incredible. He's got one called Brewing with Wheat. If you're really interested in wheat beer, he's got Brewing Like a Monk. There's plenty of other resources out there. I'm happy to sort of compile a list if you'd like. But yeah, there's a lot of great, easy to read books out there.
Thank you, sir. We don't want to take up the crazy happy hour that we all have now. I know they're different than they used to be, but that's kind of the point of these sessions a little bit, is that we can hang out even in our cloistered state and enjoy each other's company, have a good chat, cheers a little bit. I'm probably just going to drink straight out of this bottle before the whole session's over. That being said, more coming up. Again, 4/23, next Thursday, the Industry Roundtable with all those beautiful people that I mentioned off the top. And then just a few days after that, that Sunday, I think that is the 26th of April, if I'm recalling correctly, we're going to do Taking Flights with Fisher. If you guys hadn't heard about it, we're going to be our intrepid co-founder and head brewer, Neil Fisher, is going to be walking us through, folks who sign up for it, or even if you don't, a 4-pack that he's put together custom, talking about history, process, procedure, all that fun stuff. And we'll just kind of get into the weeds a little bit on that one. So that's going to be a bit of a smaller group. And then we're just going to kind of keep things rolling. And we do have some homebrew classes coming up as well with our very own Wade Meyer, who is an absolute stud on all fronts as far as that is concerned. We'll post all that information as soon as we possibly can. Until then, I'm going to go back to my Taylor Swift song bracket. That's right, 64 Taylor Swift songs that I am going through and ranking against each other to see which one comes out as the undisputed absolute champion of all Taylor Swift songs. I've never heard any of them. I'm just kind of rolling with it, you know, kind of seeing what happens as we go along. It was Neil's idea. Blame him. I don't know. Anyways, guys, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. PC, you fucking rock. All of you folks are great, and hopefully we will catch y'all soon. Cheers.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks.